And over to you, Constance.
Thank you so much. So good to see everybody, and everybody looks very active for a Monday. Just brilliant. I only saw one with a not doing so great, but we hope by the end of this you feel really good. So welcome back, everyone. Welcome to anyone who's a newcomer that's joining. This is the Foresight for Future Planning training series. And I just want to tell you that the training series has been organized by Cardessa in collaboration with the ACRA project. And it's supported by the CUTUP XP4, funded by the EU, and that is administered through our colleagues at IFAD. So the overall learning objectives, I just want to keep bringing these back in, is to introduce the Foresight method. So that's going to be our approach to catalyzing transformational planning so that we're really taking into account the uncertainties in the future and being ready for those, to demonstrate practical and concrete methods so that we can ensure that we are ready to use these tools, and to demonstrate those methods using the context of climate resilience in food systems, in agriculture. So now I want to just take hold of where we are today. So I'll talk a bit more about what we're going to do today in a minute, but we are going to focus in on developing scenarios. And that is one of the really fun parts of Foresight. So be ready. And 4 is coming up on Wednesday, our series number 4. And we really hope that you'll come back, because this is going to be a great opportunity to get very practical, to talk about the Foresight support that might be needed to really move this forward in your teams, in your institutions. So do be ready to come back. Now, quick poll. Thank you so much to Pierre Andrea. We wanted to know if you joined sessions 1, session 2, both, or you're new to the series. We'd like to know this as we go into the recap. Okay, excellent. Thank you for responding. All right, we're going to get up to 80%. And there we go. So we can share that one. Whoop. Yeah. All right, in large part, the majority of us have been here for both. Sabrina and I managed to show up for both as well. Some came only one person came for session 1 only so far, and 4 are new to the series, and we have 4 that joined us in the last series. So thank you very much. We're really glad you are here with us today. All right, so today's objectives. We are going to get into causal analysis and thinking in systems as part of our Foresight process. We're going to introduce how do you actually develop scenarios so that you can explore possible futures. We're going to dive into the basics of how you make these in terms of identifying those drivers for us that are most impactful, most uncertain. And we're going to demonstrate concretely how you develop the narratives that accompany those scenarios. So with that, the flow of events really follows the learning objectives. So I don't think I have to go into too much detail on those, but at this point, what I would propose is that I continue for Sabrina as she takes the floor.
Great. Thank you so much. And we're going to be doing a little recap, which will focus a little bit more on session 2. But I know just from the poll, we have 4 participants, but potentially more that are joining for the first time. So welcome. And Please see everyone else who's been in the training. You are all now Foresight experts and practitioners. So please feel free to keep adding some definitions and helping our new participants along. So I'm just going to try and do a quick recap, which focuses more on our session 2 when we looked at trends and trend analysis and also setting up a Foresight exercise. So just to go back to some of the original definitions about understanding foresight, and specifically strategic foresight being the ability to create high definition forward views and apply them in an organized way. And this is how we've been trying to really get across the concept around foresight and what foresight is. So just to really sort of bring those new participants into the frame, we're really looking at a set of tools and methods that allow us to look and plan for the future. So as well as the kind of definition around foresight, we also had some kind of frameworks and ideas. So we're going to have a fill in the blank. So what we'll see, there'll be a sentence, and then we'll ask you to fill in the blank by putting it in the chat box. So, and for those that are new, I'm sorry, because you won't maybe have a learning objective, but you maybe, instead of saying what you have learned, you can say what you hope to learn for those that are new. So the ones that are, so for everybody else, based on session 1 and session 2, we'd love to know something that really stuck in your learning. What did you really take away from session 1 and 2? What was something that you've learned that's really sort of stuck from the training so far? So if you can put those in the chat box, that would be really useful. And again, for those participants that are new, please feel free to say something that you want to learn, so we can also capture those viewpoints. So if you can fill in the blank and put it in the chat box, something based on the last sessions you've evidence. Great. Analyzing trends, horizon scanning, transforming agriculture, building relationships with stakeholders, trends. These are great. Any other key kind of things that have stuck or learning trends? Steep, stakeholder maps and timelines. Ooh, great. I think some people are already answering our next fill in the blank. So Constance, can you just flip over? So the acronym that helps me ensure that I'm looking at multiple dimensions to try and understand trends. What would that be? And I think we have some people, STEEP, that's right. And if anyone wants to try and unpack that acronym for our new participants a little more, what each part of STEEP means. And we also had, Noni, for example, had given us another example of a framework that helps you split up trends. So if anyone also has a way of doing kind of different categories for analyzing trends, please put any information there. Angela's very handily breaking up STEEP. For those new, they'll be able to see what STEEP means. So yes, just to quickly recap, one of the tools we looked at last week was really around analyzing trends and horizon scanning. And one of the critical things is to be able to not be sort of biased in your background or in your kind of thematic area, so that when we're looking at historical trends and we're looking for current and what we call signals, we're making sure to look across different dimensions. So from both sociological, environmental, institutional, political, etc. So thank you so much, Clemens. Great. Thanks so much for those putting the answers in the block. So the next slide. We also last week, as in our second session, after kind of using the first session to define foresight and some of the approaches, especially around transformation, in the second session, we unpacked what were the key sort of questions in what we call the scope phase, which is the first part of setting up a foresight exercise. So we had 5 parts to the scope phase. And I don't know, again, if anybody wanted to offer up anything in terms of what do you need to know in terms of setting up the scope phase. Do you remember any of those key questions that we tried, or key parts of the scope phase? What were the things we really wanted to define when we set up a foresight exercise? Themed, great. question around what seems to be happening. Thanks, Olga. That's fantastic because that gets at our kind of core foresight questions. That's great. Those are so you guys are answering what are the situation. This is getting at it. Fantastic. What's really happening? Yes, that's another foresight question. Fantastic. So you guys are now answering some of the key questions around the sort of defining foresight questions. So for the scope, we had 5 key areas that we wanted to define. We'll just go back. There we go. So we had we're starting to get at these now in terms of the scope really fits under what we see as the situational analysis. So the first part of a foresight process is always understanding where have you come from and where are you right now. So in the beginning, when you set up your foresight exercise, and this is something following the training and going forwards, we really want to kind of try and help with in terms of how do you get into your own kind of foresight process. You need to set up the key theme and topic. And I think even last week, we unpacked a theme around agri-food system resilience. And I think we learned and saw that even if you think your theme can be quite simple, there is a lot that goes into defining what your theme and topic is. We then set a boundary. So where would your foresight exercise focus from a kind of geopolitical point of view? You would have to understand things such as shared watercourses, political, administrative boundaries, and this can go right from a village level through to kind of a continental scale foresight exercise. So that's the second part of your scope. And then really critical was understanding the relevant structures and policies that are in place. Again, we went through some of the layerings in terms of even if you're at a national level, which I think we heard last week, most people were planning at the national scale, some at the subnational. And then importantly, I think, thanks so much, a lot of you have already put that in the chat box about setting your timeline. So are you looking to try and do future planning 10, 15, 20, 30, 60 years in advance? So I think these things were really critical in terms of your foresight process. And then mapping your stakeholders initially. So who needs to be engaged, both in terms of your initial team, but also who are the stakeholders that you're going to interact with and you think are critical for understanding kind of your foresight objective. And then that's kind of, those are the 5 key themes around scope. And then just to show you, and for those new, don't get too overwhelmed by this, but we also have been using a foresight framework. So we are running through a process where, as you'll see across the top, we try to understand both the situational analysis in a foresight process. And once we understand what's happening, and we ask questions such as what is happening and why it's happening, we then move into this more kind of long-term future planning process within a foresight approach. We really ask what is the future we want to look like? What might we need to do differently? And what might happen that we have not thought about? And this is the really critical shift in a foresight process. And I think the most critical shift from a kind of skills perspective is having that mindset to be able to envision very, very different futures than we have right now. Yeah, so that's the foresight framework that we kind of keep referring to, and we're going to kind of go into it again. And on Wednesday, we'll be wrapping up in terms of different tools and methods and support going forwards for that. And just to finish in the recap, there's really no standardized way of doing foresight. You might have just seen the framework again and a whole set of methods and tools, but there is no set process you have to go through that is the perfect kind of foresight process. The methods and skills and approaches that you do is really dependent on the question that either potentially you have a policy that you're working on or a strategic planning process, or you're working on a kind of a research undertaking. Depending on what you're doing, the tools and methods you use in your foresight approach will be different and will speak to the question you have. With that, I'd just like to then hand over to Constance, who's going to help us dive into one of the key tools. Sorry, you just muted, Constance.
No, I saw that. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. Okay, so thanks for that recap. And so right now, what I'd like to do is jump into thinking in systems and causal analysis. And so let's just talk about what that means in terms of the framework. So when we're still doing our situational analysis, we really want to be able to interpret all those trends, everything that we've put in place. And so we have a question in our or now 5, because someone offered up what happened. So we've added that in. So what we want to answer with causal analysis, with interpretation of evidence, is really what is really happening, not just what we perceive to be happening. And so with that, we just want to remind ourselves that we often treat symptoms instead of root causes of our issues when we are planning or deciding what our interventions are. So I want to spend a few minutes on a root cause analysis. It's just a simple causal analysis. It's used to understand what underpins the barriers that we've identified, those barriers that are going to keep us from getting to our desired outcome. What underpins those? So we know we're treating root causes. So as a first step for that, you would brainstorm on all of the barriers that you have, perceived drivers, and you would identify those that you think are the top priority. So in this case, what we're going to do is we are just going to take the example of water scarcity, because a lot of people are talking about this right now. And what we want to do is we want to unpack the causes and the implications if we do nothing. So for example, one of the issues that we have, we would say, well, it's really the overuse of available water resources. But what's underpinning that? Is it a lack of awareness, particularly by the urban users? Is there unequal access to water? Are we being exploitative? Because we have different scales of agriculture going on, a lack of conservation, or even greed. So these are some of the things that are underpinning as causes. Then we might find that we have really poor management policies, or we have policies and they're not being implemented, or they're very single sector, so that we're not actually working around water as a whole, in integrated ways, but we're working just through one, perhaps water ministry. Unsustainable practices in agriculture and natural resources, a lack of awareness of ways to actually maintain the land health, or we might even have weak institutions, weak extension, and a lot of times people say that we have reduced rainfall because of the weather patterns, but we do need to understand that underneath that, we're seeing a loss of biodiversity, a loss of vegetation, and we are seeing, perhaps driving that, poor land management practices. So we're seeing an array of causes and root causes. This is what lies beneath. And we know that these have enormous implications for us in terms of increased time for women and girls trying to seek water, or a loss of tourism. People are not coming because things have dried up. We might see more and more conflicts. We may see people moving, migrating, a lack of safe drinking water, or even electricity shortages, which we have seen often because of this. So those are some of the implications of not treating it. But what that tells you is that just when you say water scarcity, you are seeing that you have social issues around that, economic issues, political issues, institutional, environmental, and they may have more. So it helps us understand the multiple dimensions. Now, one other thing that can be a barrier is actually people's perceptions. So, or a deeply held belief. Sometimes it's hard to move past those. Those become a barrier, and you need to keep those in mind when you're doing root cause analysis. So when we're trying to tackle issues, we want to think about, what is a deeply held belief, or what is a perception that people have that's going to keep us from finding a solution? So I wanted to know if anyone has such a thing in mind. So a perception, this is a fill in the blank into the chat box, a perception or strongly held belief about water scarcity that I am aware of. Can we see if there's any feedback on that? Thank you, Pierre.
Yeah, sure.
Pierre has put the fill in the blank in there. Is there a perception? The gods are unhappy. Water was blocked deliberately by the government. Ooh, that there is enough water in the world, plenty. The sin of people, goodness, you guys are brilliant at this. But you can see that these are things you have to take into account when you start looking at root causes. Good gracious, not following traditional rules. So we're not saying that some of these perceptions don't have a basis, but we do want to make sure that we are taking those into account. Brilliant. I am seeing, and I'm also seeing some other causes, lack of storage facilities, for example. All right. So I am going to skip this one for now.
I think it's great, Constance. I think to go ahead.
Keep this one up?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So if you were bringing people together to talk about water scarcity, which kinds of stakeholders, now that we've analyzed it and seen all these different dimensions, which kinds of stakeholders would you invite to find solutions? Can you name a couple? All right, community opinion leaders, the government. Any specific or different sectors of the government? Traditional leaders. All right, government departments. Fishermen. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. Look at all this. The water regulations body and the consumers. Wow. All right, you guys are on to this. The wash departments. This is brilliant. Okay, so it's exactly what you're talking about. It's exactly what you're talking about in that sorry, I'm just trying to get my slides to advance. And this is exactly what we like to do as an early stage, looking at the kinds of stakeholders that you would want to engage, particularly as you're moving your foresight process forward. So we had some examples that you would have multiple dimensions of multiple departments from the government that would be important, the different community organizations, different NGOs that are constantly doing interventions around water scarcity. You would have private sector, and you might invite research institutions, the media, to really get those facts out there, donors and UN bodies, etc. So I just want to touch quickly now on planning within a system. So we are continually talking about this food system that we're trying to become more climate resilient. And so we've shown this slide before, but it just unpacks that we have so many dimensions. So we've got social, we've got economic, we've got environmental, we have cultural, and we have political dimensions that are all affecting the food system. So it's always really nice to be able to map that system out so you can see the interchange among the different actors, the different players, and ensure that you're really, really understanding it. And then, so we say that when we understand a system that we're working in, that we have a better sense of how drivers of change impact different dimensions in the system. And I'm just going to give very few examples here. So for example, if we have an environmental driver such as land degradation, and what happens in the system because of that? So you look at the system and you say, oh my goodness, we are probably going to have people that are going to be hungry and not going to be able to afford the basic commodities. People won't have school fees. There's going to be a need for food. We may have, in some cases, food waste, people seeking additional work, etc. For our price hikes, we may see a similar, I'm going to say one quick thing. I think these got reversed. I think this is the land degradation one. Because if you look at this, you would see, but you may see these exact same things. If you have food price hikes, you may see that people are going to go hungry. They're not going to be, they're going to, if they have to buy food, they're going to have to trade off something else. It could be education. And you can do this for several, like what is youth employment? How is that going to impact my food system? So I think I'm going to stop here and just thank you for that, for listening to that. We just want to make sure that we're always looking at the underpinning elements. And if there are any quick questions, I see Karen.
Thank you. I'm just wondering about your thinking in systems and the questions. When you say that the questions are what happened, what seems to be happening, and what's really happening, how do you differentiate between that? Because isn't it all a bit relative? You know, if it's the same person asking the questions, is it your source? Are you saying that the source of your information is then determined by the systems and that's what helps you to differentiate? Or it's kind of stumping me a little bit.
Okay, I'm not quite sure I got the question right. I realize that, you know, some of these questions, we put them in a very specific flow, but often you're looking at them together. But we do feel like that you do need to have, and it's actually quite useful to have the stakeholders that are with you help you map the system and help you think together about the system and about how different drivers might, what the implications might be on the system. Sabrina, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I think, and great question, Karen, because there's a lot of, and especially for those joining, there is a lot of layers in a foresight process where we have different stages and steps. And then within each of those, we also have these kind of core defining questions, which is what Karen related to in terms of a foresight process. So and it was really great because I think on the second session, someone said, well, wouldn't we also ask what happened? So that's when we look backwards. And I think, Karen, in terms of the question that relates most to this kind of exercise of causal analysis, and also kind of when we start to map out our system, we say what is really happening. And when we say what is really happening, it's because often a root cause analysis is not really sort of part of a strategic planning process. We often will build a strategic plan based on potentially the sort of framework of the last 5 years. And Constance and I have found this. We've been actually working quite closely with the government up in northern Kenya for a number of years on sort of integrated development planning, and introducing this kind of concept of like, let's take stock and actually say, why are these things continuing to happen? Why are we seeing potentially conflict in one area? Why are we starting to see issues with water scarcity that is kind of perpetuating? So really what seems to be happening in a foresight process is really trying to make you stop and take stock of, is there actually an underlying cause that we continue to like not plan for? So I hope that helps kind of add on to Constance's response. And I see we have another question, Constance.
Okay. And thank you, Karen. And please, if you want to add further to the question, please do in the chat box and we'll see what we can do about that. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the other question.
Oh, no, sorry, it's Karen's hand, same hand. If there's any other questions, please let us know. And Karen, if there's more we can expand on, just put in the chat box and we can try and unpack.
No, that makes a lot more sense. Thanks. I just, yeah, having it with the stakeholders and then it being time bound makes a lot more sense now. Thanks.
Sure, no problem.
Super. All right. So I see a question from Darian, who's, yay,
Hey.
I hope you're able to connect with us today well. Darian.
I'm in bed and I hope so. Okay. I'm super comfortable, you know. I'm a 9, I can be a 10, but anyway. My question is, we are at the stage that we need to identify what are the root causes of this situation that we are in, whatever the environment we want to explore. But isn't it one of the main problems that many institutions and governments have, that they are unable to define the scope? So they don't go through this thing, unable to come together to identify the problems, and therefore you cannot just foresee whatever is going to happen because you cannot focus. Thank you.
I think that's an excellent question. Thank you so much, Darian. And I do think that's true. But you do find that, for example, in national development plans, different groups have to come together. And that's an ideal place to try and get people to talk about the root causes. And sometimes, just to simplify, if you get people working on a vision, which we're going to talk about more next time, then you can use that vision to say, okay, what are the barriers, and then unpack the barriers, and then you might get more distributive or collaborative work. At least that's what we've seen. We've seen people be able to say, actually, these 5 government agencies and NGOs, UN, and researchers need to all be working on that solution. But the one last thing I would say is you can do a root cause analysis on a policy to see if it's actually getting at the cause, because we often see policies that address symptoms instead of root causes. So I see that someone said, don't put the researchers in under other, and I'm a researcher, so I get you. We'll make sure we make another column next time. Thank you for that. So I think we now need to probably move on. And Sabrina, do you want me to continue with my screen? I did a terrible job of forwarding slides. So
no,
or
it's
do you
fine.
want to share?
I'll share, that's fine. And just
great.
while we swap screens, Intle is just asked about the slides of implications and causes. Intle will be sharing all the resources at the end of the series, and all the recordings and the slides, etc. So we'll be able to share them again. Just in the interest of time, we'll just have to continue with the session. But if you have a specific question on causes or implications, please put in the chat box, and Constance can help you as well. So I will just quickly share my screen, and we are now going on to introducing and trying to dive into scenarios as one of the, I guess, one of the best known methods, and one of the sort of deeper methods in a foresight process in terms of planning for the future. So in our first session, we had a poll, and we'd asked what tools or techniques or kind of exposures to foresight. And a number of people had mentioned that they had experience with scenarios. So I don't know if there's anybody who would like to put into the chat box potentially to answer that question for us, just to see how have people been exposed to scenarios? Was it through a training, or is this something that they've done? So yeah, if anyone wants to kind of respond in the chat box as I go along, that'll be really useful just to hear when you've heard of scenarios, what you've done with those, and maybe have you actually brought them into a process in terms of your work. So please continue to respond. Piers, put the question there in the chat box, and we'll refer back to that in the session, and I'll just keep going. So and Karen, thanks again for reminding us of some of the key questions around a foresight process. Here we now move into kind of the next stage of the framework, where we really ask this, what might happen? And I think in the first session, we really tried to unpack what are some of the key skills as a foresight practitioner. And this skill of really being able to imagine possible different futures is very critical. And it's the kind of skill set of having both a curious mind, but also being able to look at sort of some of these trends and evidence and start to think what might happen in the future. And really, again, going back, that the kind of premise of being able to do foresight is that the future can still be actively influenced. So where we might go or be directed can still be very much influenced in the way we put together our strategies and our planning process and policies, etc. now. And that's really the premise around foresight. And this is hopefully also a good introduction for those joining today. Foresight really has these kind of 3 core time zones that we plan in. We have a set of tools and methods that help us look historically. We then look and assess what's happening in the present. And then we start to put together some tools and methods that help us anticipate the future. And now in this scenario process, this is really about anticipating into the future. So in terms of doing a scenario process, and especially when we try to really unpack long-term planning, and those of you potentially who are involved in climate change planning will know that some of the official processes really want to take out to 2050. For example, countries are meant to put together a long-term strategic plan for low emissions development. So that's starting to say, can we start to plan 30 years in advance? We know that Africa, we have our national development goals going up to 2063. So we're starting to really see, how do we do 40 years in advance planning? And we know that some of these kind of difficulties come with both dealing at the moment with the complexity in the system. We have to try and look across these multiple decades. We then have to try and anticipate changes such as future climate impacts, technologies, policy development, large-scale solutions, and current data models and skills. What might happen that we've not thought about before? So this is really the kind of guiding question that we have when we try to do scenarios, is we try to really say, is there something that might happen that we've not thought about before? And I think being and living through these times in terms of the COVID-19 global pandemic have really been a very striking process in terms of scenarios, and saying, if scenarios had been carried out and put into policy and practice, would they have helped us deal with the pandemic a little bit more? So just going back to the guiding framework that we showed, we now start to move quite significantly into the second part of a foresight process, really around long-term future planning. And we're really answering this question about what might happen. So to define scenarios, they're a method that help us think about possible future states. So really how these uncertainties that we've just thought about might play out. How might they play out over a certain time frame? You really try to answer what if questions. So if we have multiple alternative futures and we have many uncertainties, with the scenario process, you say, what if? So back in 2019, if you were modeling public health pandemics, would you have said, what if we have a global pandemic? What would happen? And I guess many people would ask if we could do that. And I think for those with a South African audience, we haven't presented it as a case study today, but the use of scenarios has come up a lot in conversation in the last week, because many people who are in long-term planning were saying the situation in South Africa, where we've had this breakout of looting and riots and political instability, and many people had seen this coming. So we were saying, what if all of these processes came together and we had an outbreak of violence like we've seen in the last week? So just to kind of ground you, that scenarios is a very, very powerful method, especially in policy and strategic planning. And really, scenarios try to help capture these kind of uncertainties in the future. And we start to then think, right, if we have these uncertainties, what do we need to do in terms of our current planning processes and action? So just to go back over the definition, it's the what if questions that's important for you to remember, and thinking about multiple alternative futures. And each of those futures might go in different directions. So if you're going to take away anything, I think that's critical about this, the what if questions, the different directions, and the different possible futures. In terms of scenarios, they must be plausible. Is it reasonable to assume that a scenario could happen? So the word plausibility thinks about a future situation. Could it happen? Then if it's viable, is the scenario you're thinking through, could it be done or could it occur? So again, this is a difficult one often in scenario planning, where, again, if I take the COVID-19 example, some people would have said it's not even plausible that we would have had a global pandemic. So they wouldn't have maybe run a scenario process. So these ideas around scenarios must be plausible. It must be reasonable that it could actually happen. It must be viable. So this can actually be done. So we're not kind of imagining a completely off the radar future. And it's not predictive. Scenarios are not they're not a predictable actually might happen. They bring together qualitative and quantitative evidence, as well as participatory multiple views to plan for the future, but it's not a complete exact prediction. So in terms of building the scenario process, there again, in terms of the training here, we are going to run through a couple of steps and essentially what would be an easy process to do this. And there are many different ways of building scenarios. We are going to run you through what would be quite a common but a simple way that hopefully can be applied in your setting to run through the steps. So we have a 7-step process that we'll run through that takes us from defining the focal issue right through to looking at and building storylines. So the first thing is really identifying the drivers of change in the system that you're thinking of, in the scope that you've defined, the timelines, the structures and policies that you're working with, and the stakeholders. You've also already done your root cause in your Foresight process. You've looked at your system. You then say, right, what are these drivers of change that are happening? So to define a driver, it's a factor, an issue, or a trend that may cause change affecting or shaping the future. And an interesting definition also, we have internal drivers. We have an internal force of change. For example, if we were thinking about a farm or a community, you would say an internal driver could be an individual farmer's decision. But an external driver might be the market prices within that village. That farmer doesn't have any impact on that. That's an external driver coming into the system. So when you think of drivers, you think, are there internal drivers and there external drivers as well? So in your process, if you were going to do a scenario, setting up a scenario process like this, and you were going to brainstorm your drivers, you would get your group together and you would really do what we call a kind of open-ended brainstorm, where you would really just try and think of every different driver that would affect your system. What is happening that's impacting your kind of core question? And you would brainstorm these kind of broadly and put them together in a kind of just open brainstorm session. The next part of that is once we have this open brainstorm of all these critical drivers, you need to start to organize them for your scenario process. So again, like we had the STEEP framework for trends, when we think of drivers, we also encourage that you can break these up. Are these economic drivers? Are they sociocultural? Could they be about agricultural productivity or natural resources or governance? And again, these categories don't fall into an official framework like STEEP, because you might be doing a scenario exercise, for example, on technology or energy, and therefore one of these drivers might not be as specific. But what is critical as the skill set is when you have a set of drivers, you need to start organizing these into categories. So what we would then do is take this kind of wide brainstorm and start to categorize our drivers into these different formats and start to say, are some of these drivers related specifically to economic or to environmental futures, or is it about sociocultural issues? In our case, is something linked to agriculture and productivity. And then once you have these drivers that are grouped, we then need to start to organize them, because we can't take all of these forward into a scenario process. And what we try and do with a scenario process is you're looking at high impact and high uncertainty, because the drivers that we know are how they're going to change in the future, we don't need to do as much of a scenario planning on them. It's the drivers that we know least about. So the things in the future that we are most uncertain about is what we need to really do in a scenario process on. We need to try and unpack that uncertainty to be able to do future planning. So with this, you then have your categories of drivers and you try to understand impact. So what's the scale of impact of that driver? How much is it going to affect the future? And then uncertainty. How certain or uncertain are you about how this driver will play out? There's some things such as population growth. We can model it quite predictably and say, we're actually quite certain how population growth might happen in this area. But there's things such as climate risk or flooding potential. And we say, actually, these drivers are very uncertain. And then again, what you take forward is what we call these critical uncertainties. So drivers that are high impact and high uncertainty. So if anyone asks you after this with a scenario process, what you're thinking about is high impact and high uncertainty. This is how you plan best in terms of the future. So we're going to do a quick chatter for, and for those who are new, How this works is basically we're going to ask a question. You're going to type it in the chat box, but do not press send yet. And then when we say press send, we're all going to send at the same time. So that's how the technique works. So here's your question. What driver do you think will be highly impactful in your country in the next 10 years? So have a think. Remember, don't press send yet. We're all going to do it at the same time. So a little bit more of a think. What driver is going to be highly impactful? And go. Let's see. Technology, ICT, politics, water stress, land degradation, water, agriculture, drought, wow, drought, climate risk, drought, participation of communities, politics, wow. Highly impactful driver. This is so interesting. Water and digital agriculture, climate change, markets, droughts, policy change, flooding. Wow, this is really, really interesting to see what people are really thinking are going to be these very impactful drivers in the future. Super. Okay, keep those coming. Thanks so much. And I did notice some people's names, we still don't have those. So Pierre will be able to help us ensure that everybody's renamed so we can see where everyone is and their names. So thank you so much for sort of seeing what you think would be a highly impactful driver. I'm now going to just kind of go on in terms of how we then rank our drivers. Once we've brainstormed our drivers, we've categorized them, and then we start to rank them. And remember, we're doing it in terms of impact. Are they low or high impact? And are they in terms of uncertainty? Is it high uncertainty or low? And this might sound quite easy, but being a Foresight practitioner and doing scenarios, this is really not that easy. So we're going to try and break it down for you a little bit in terms of an example. So you've been with us, for those who've been with us since the series began, we have been using the example of an agri-food system and looking at food systems and climate resilience, especially in Southern Africa, as some of our examples to try and teach Foresight methods. So again, we're going to stay in terms of the food system to understand the drivers. And we're going to try and see, this is the kind of table you could build. So if you were doing a planning session within your team and you'd been brainstorming drivers and setting up your Foresight exercise, this is how you could facilitate some of your colleagues or whoever you would be engaging into your Foresight process. So for example, if we're thinking about the future food system and we've defined, we're planning out to 2030, so we're thinking in 10 years time within our geographic region, what's going to be a driver? So if we think about areas, expanding areas of major commodities, that's a driver that someone in our team has brainstormed and said that's going to affect the food system. Is that going to be impactful? Yes, this is actually could be very high impact in terms of commodities, what's going to be coming into the system, how the kind of growth or the production of major commodities is going to go. Uncertainty, this actually might be low because we might be able to model or look in terms of commodity demand and growth and actually understand this fairly well. And in terms of population growth, if we take another driver, impactful, again, yes, this could be very high impact, but in terms of uncertainty, this is potentially quite low because we are again able to model population quite well. So if we're thinking about the food system, another driver, open borders. So when we have free trade, if we have open borders and we don't have any kind of trade restrictions, how impactful? This could be very high in terms of impact on the food system, but are we able to understand or predict how open our borders might be in 5 to 10 years? We would say potentially no, this is quite uncertain. And just taking one last driver, if we're thinking about export regulations, and for those of us who are in the SADC region, one of the biggest impacts on the food system, and especially the beef industry, has been an EU regulation that came in about exports. And this really impacted a huge area of production, countries such as Botswana, in terms of being able to export beef. So this impact would be very high, for example, on the food system, and very uncertain. This was a policy change that happened in the EU, and overnight, the whole of the sort of Southern Africa beef production system was put into disarray. So these are the sort of drivers. So therefore, these drivers that are high uncertainty and high impact, we take forward. So I just wanted to quickly do this, and if you were able to try and put into the chat box, because this is one of the sort of critical skills around a foresight process. So if we were again to try and think of the food system, and we thought about climate variability, do we think it's going to be high impact? And in terms of its impact, do we think it's going to be uncertain? And here we're thinking about plant pest and diseases. And we've chosen this example because we know from the attendance, we have quite a few specialists here on agronomy and plant breeding. So if we were thinking of climate variability as the driver and the impact being on plant pest and diseases, is this driver going to be high? And is it going to be certain? It'd be interesting to see some of your responses here. High and high. So I think these are some of our crop and pest specialists coming out here. So high and high in terms of impact and variability. Oh, low uncertainty. That's really interesting, Angela. So this is where it gets really interesting in your group. And I think in these exercises, you're going to get this, where there's going to be differences of opinion on certainty. And that's, again, where you really have to be critical in terms of the evidence and the trends you've gathered coming into a scenario process. So you can start to walk through and say, do we know? How much do we know about this? Is it certain or uncertain? So that's really interesting to see some of these examples coming forward. And actually, we had a really interesting question there. What is the EU regulation impact on SADC beef versus COVID restrictions on beef imports? Wow, I think we have a foresight, a scenario question right there. I think that, so this is the exact, what you've just put in the chat box is a brilliant example of a question you would run on a scenario process. That's a very, very good example because you're starting to weigh out different futures.
Serena.
Yes?
Walter? I was just going to ask if someone would explain why they said low in terms of the uncertainty.
That's great. I think maybe we can ask Angela.
It's a good conversation starter.
Yeah, it's the first one I saw. So maybe Angela, do you want to put your hand up and just explain your sort of response? I think that'd be very useful. Thanks, Constance.
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfect,
Yes.
Loud and clear.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the trading is expensive. I mean, it's interesting and worth it. But I put low then because I've attended seminars where scientists are already doing research telling us what is going to happen in the next 40 years due to climate change. The data is being collected by scientists in South Africa, in Cape Town specifically. I even asked them, why are you focusing in Cape Town? And they said to me, we are able to do this for the entire countries. They were even showing the extent on which fruits will be affected. The current fruits that they are producing now, what might happen as climate change takes place. So it now come back to this training. If the data is there, are we able to use it? If we use it, yes, the impact might be low, but if we don't and we ignore the information that is there, that's where we get a high and high. So I thought for me it's high and low based on what I have seen and the seminars and the discussions between the research academia and the higher institutes of learning. Even farmers came in and asked projects and say, how advanced is research? Are you ready with the new cultivars that can work in that scenario? And they said, as time goes by, we will be able to do that. I hope I gave a clear answer, but for me, it's a low because information is there.
Great, Angela, that was a perfect response. Thank you. That's so valuable. We'll take Darian's question and then we can just respond to that quickly.
On that point, for example, it will be high and medium for me, because even though the research is based on models, because you cannot really predict with a lot of certainty the future, you can ascertain certain things, but I would say medium, but in terms of, because we are based on models, not on real facts. Thank you.
Sure, that's great. Yeah, so I just would quickly just respond to both sort of Angela's and Darian's point there. I think it's very critical. And I think remembering back to when we put together the Foresight sort of framework, and at the top, if you remember, across all stages, we had evidence as one of the critical kind of processes, and also stakeholder engagement, knowledge, and creativity. And I think in terms of knowledge and knowledge systems and participation, that's what's also really critical here, because Angela was saying, oh, there's been data and it's been modeled and it's coming out of, you know, we all know, for example, in Southern Africa, the University of Cape Town has a very strong climate change research unit, and we're getting a lot of like localized climate change knowledge coming out. But in terms of how do you either apply that evidence and start to put that with other knowledge systems and thinking about your plan, that's why it's very, very valuable. And I hope this is also just from the question and answers inspired you how powerful a scenario process can be, even if you don't take a deep dive, but getting your group and those who are involved in either kind of a foresight or a planning process to really start to unpack and question and be critical of these different viewpoints and these evidence pieces, to start to say, if we start to see these drivers together, what kind of future are we getting? And I think this is really also the power of a scenario process, is starting to think what might be happening if we put these different drivers together. And so often this process that we're in, this stage around selecting high impact and high uncertainty, this can take quite a bit of time, and it's very useful to get this validated and lots of different participation and lots of different viewpoints. And again, you might have to revisit the evidence and say, actually, before we continue with our scenario process, we want to do a bit more research. We want to dig up some more evidence on these trends so that we can really continue with kind of more confidence in our selection of the drivers. So we would also kind of try and get that across from a foresight process. It's not a linear set of steps. You don't start from planning and then finish at strategy. If you are diving into these tools and methods and you start to think, we don't have enough data to hand, you go back and you dig up and you do another trends analysis. And maybe even in your trends analysis, you realize you missed out one of the categories. So you didn't think about environmental trends, you maybe were focused more on political trends. So just to also reiterate, as you are now emerging as foresight practitioners and experts, that it's not a linear process. We might have to go back to some of these original steps we got through to make sure that we kind of progress with confidence in these approaches. So I'm just watching time, and I'll just be ready to hand over to Constance just now, who's going to help us in terms of building a scenario kind of matrix. So just to say where we are in the process, once we then have these drivers, we start to then finalize a list that we're going to build a scenario axis with. And these would be those that are high impact and high uncertainty. So you would have this list that you would take forwards. So Constance, I'm going to stop my share and hand over to you. Or would you like me to continue?
No, that's great. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to jump in here. Let me just share my screen.
And we're getting some really nice responses here. Dr. Peppola was just saying, I think that's a very valid point in terms of a difference between climate change and climate variability. And that's something we can go in terms of the definitions. So thanks, Constance, for responding to that. So I'll just hand over to Constance, who's going to take us through the sort of step 6 and 7 in this scenario building process around the scenario axis and the storylines.
Okay, thank you, Sabrina. And thanks to all the participants. Those are great responses. And I feel like we are really, you're very quick to understand how do we actually get the high impact and the high uncertain and the dialogue that's needed to discuss that. It's yet another point that we need to have multiple stakeholders at the table talking and also looking at the evidence. So once we have defined that table of high impact and high uncertainty, those critical uncertainties, what we're going to want to do is, first of all, set up, take 2 of those drivers that we've decided are high and juxtapose them in a graph. So I'm going to say scenario 1, we want to look at the national border closing at one end out to regional integration at another, low youth unemployment to high youth unemployment And I'll show you how this works. So we've already identified that these particular drivers are high and high. So what you would like to do then is to identify, what that looks like on the low end, what it looks like on the high end. So for example, if we say youth unemployment, we want to know what happens if it stays low, what happens if it goes to a high. And we know a bit that we're moving in that direction. Same thing with regional integration. The opposite of regional integration is going to be the borders are closing on us. So now we've built our axes for our first set of scenarios. And within this context, we're going to want to be looking at the different combinations of those four. So we're going to be looking in the quadrants of each of those that we've laid out. So now we're moving towards building our storylines. And Sabrina's already mentioned that these need to be plausible, viable, feasible. And so we want to bear those in mind. And as we have kept track throughout these now 3 sessions, we really like to categorize or use dimensions in order to build the storylines. And Sabrina's just mentioned that we want to make sure we're not forgetting something. Now, again, it's going to be based on what's appropriate to the theme that you're unpacking. So in this case, we are looking at those same categories: sociocultural, economic, environmental, political, institutional, agricultural, and agricultural productivity in this case. So as we start to unpack the scenario, the storylines, in each of these quadrants, we want to describe what would be the impact of with good regional integration and high youth unemployment. We're going to say, well, what does that mean in terms of education, in terms of gender? What does it mean in terms of investments? What does it mean in terms of what's going to happen to the environment? So a lot of times when you think about these particular 2 drivers that we've juxtaposed, you don't always think about all those dimensions. So this helps us get in that way. So now let's just take an example, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what would happen. So if we're looking at a situation where we have closed borders, the national borders are closed, and we have high youth unemployment, let's take one dimension and describe it. This is practice. Okay, so high youth unemployment, high nationalism, or closed borders. In the chat box, I'm very keen for you to tell me, what does the future look like for the economy if we have those 2 things happening together?
And it consists 10 years?
Yes, I think we set our timeline at 2030 for this exercise. Or it might have been, let's go with 10 years for now. What are you going to see? Find
economic isolation, bleak. Agreed.
Okay. Exactly. So this is very useful. So you really are trying to juxtapose those 2 drivers, and this is, what we might say, this is really worst case, right?
Yeah.
When you see these
so
2
economic, Dumisani says economic performance might be uncertain. Hunger for imported products, so we're seeing a demand shift there. No economic growth, economic crisis, theft, high domestic innovation, innovativeness, political unrest, skewed economy towards the adult working class. And then it depends in terms of industrialization and improving exports.
Excellent analysis. So we're starting to get some scenario storylines to describe what that would look like if that's our future. So now, so what we did is just sort of quickly put a few storylines in. You've already got a handle on this, but if we did the same thing for all of the dimensions, we would start to see the various things that are going to happen if we let this future be our future. In terms of the political, we're seeing increased nationalism. We may have the institutions not necessarily addressing systems because they're getting more competitive. Unemployment is going to make it challenging to feed families. So there may be increased land degradation, deforestation, hunting, potential conflict. So these are our scenario storylines that we're bringing together. So if this is our future, these are the things that we might see. So if this is one of our possible futures, these are the things we need to plan to ensure that they're not happening. Okay, political unrest. Well done. All right, so let's try another one. We're going to stay in this scenario with these two drivers juxtaposed. And now let's go where we have low youth unemployment and where we have very solid regional integration. Things are moving across borders, things are being managed together. All right, so now let's try that one. And I want to know what's going to happen to agricultural productivity if I have low youth unemployment and high regional integration. For agricultural productivity, ooh, an economic boom. We're going to see a lot of exports. All right, we might see migration. And we actually might see, because we have low unemployment, we may see people coming into the country to work. All right. So what does low youth unemployment mean to agricultural production? The youth become farmers. All right, surpluses, budget surpluses. All right, so we're getting quite a few positives here. And then if I could, I'm just going to take a look and say, what happens for these different dimensions, high youth unemployment and national borders. Oh, this is different. Okay, so what we were saying is that, you know, if you have, this is actually the opposite side, right? We're having high youth unemployment and closed borders. We are seeing a desire for short-term benefits, potentially. We are seeing governments have increased national budgets, but they may not focus their resources on the people that need them. So Blessing, thank you for that. Youth-led innovation in agriculture. That is absolutely brilliant. All right, so let's move on and just quickly do one more scenario. I'm checking the time. Yep. All right, so a couple of others, drivers that we said were high and high, had to do with climate risk. And again, we always want to define our terms, and disease prevalence. So again, we look at the low and high versions of those, or the extremes, if you will. So high disease prevalence, low disease prevalence is one axis, low climate risk, high climate risk is the other axis. And in this case, where we have a high climate risk and a high disease prevalence, we are going to see a huge impact on these different dimensions that we've identified related to our food system. So for example, we may see a widening wealth gap. We may see nutrition and food insecurity, social safety nets being diminished, enhanced disease prevalence, of course, And what does that mean then for our agricultural productivity? A loss of crops. Potentially with the high climate risk, we may see a loss of livestock because of drought, a loss of crops. We may see reduced sources of livelihoods, and then ultimately some increased conflict and a dramatic reduction in national productivity. And we may also see power grabs because things are getting more and more scarce. So you can see now that this gives us a picture of what could possibly happen. And ultimately, you're going to want to be looking at the 4 different quadrants so that you can determine what do you want to work to ensure doesn't happen? What do you want to work on to ensure the desirable future happens? So scenario storylines serve as plausible futures. They're going to really help you unpack insights of what may happen that we may not have considered, and very much supporting our capacity to plan accordingly. So again, these were our steps that Sabrina walked us through. And so it's very straightforward to do these 6 steps. What you're going to want to do is do multiple scenarios that are appropriate and that are based on high impact and high uncertainty, and look across those when you start to draw out what you're working for, what you're ensuring as best possible will not happen. And Sabrina also brings up the fact, and Sabrina, why don't you mention your thoughts about the time horizons within the scenarios?
Sure, could you just go back one slide, Constance? I just wanted to kind of summarize a bit on this and the process. I think the critical thing also with the scenario process is, and they're taught and they're engaged and done in different ways. And sometimes often from a research perspective, a lot of focus is put on building these narratives. So you'll get a scenario group together and then you'll really unpack these quite, they become these very in-depth stories of how the future might emerge in 15 to 20 years. But often if you are either time pressed or working within a kind of strategic policy planning process, and you maybe only have, you know, a month or less to kind of try and do some foresight approaches and look at the future planning. In a scenario process, what the value is really going to be is that you put lots of different drivers against each other and try and see the different emerging futures. Because if we only work with one driver, for example, a public health driver, and then we look at an economic driver, then we're only going to understand that future. If that public health driver and that economic driver occur, what does the future look like? What we really want to be doing is imagining lots of different unusual drivers together, because that starts to get at the complexity and the uncertainness. You want to really get all of those drivers that you listed that were high, and you want to build lots of storylines like this. So you want to run lots of scenario processes. So if you are running a brainstorming meeting or getting colleagues together to start to imagine, we would try and promote, instead of spending, for example, 2 hours just looking at, you know, 2 drivers, really try and get this sort of rapid brainstorming and ideas. And then, Constance, if you change the slide, what's also very useful if you were going to run this in your own process, and this is all part of our training approach, and what we're going to go over a bit on Wednesday, is we're trying to really build this community of practice of foresight practitioners. So we've tried to make this training in terms of you being able to take these skills and processes and do them in your own work as quickly as possible. What's very useful if you're also building your storylines. So here, if you saw this as 2 axes, and you've put two drivers against each other, you might want to try and play along different timelines. So there we were looking to 2030 as 10 years, but you might want to build out to 2050. So if an economic driver happens and there's a trade stop, what's the impact going to be in 5 years? What's it going to be in 10 years? Because if you start to do these different time horizons, it really can help you with the planning process. We have colleagues in Malawi, for example, that we're working with. They're actually putting together their long-term vision to 2063 now. So planners, and we know we've got quite a few Malarians here, which is fantastic. So in your long-term development plans and visions, the scenario process is very useful because we're starting to see, are we seeing a driver that actually in 5 years we already need to be addressing? We need to be putting plans in place, and we need to be amending a strategy or changing our resilience strategy, or vice versa. And I think one other point we wanted to bring across, I think in your examples in the chat box, we've seen that scenario storylines are not just negative or positive, they're both. So we have some things that are playing out in the future that can be negative, and we've seen that some that can be positive, such as youth innovation and domestic innovation, etc. So when you're starting to see those things in your storylines, what it becomes very important when you're thinking about your investment plans, how can we promote, or how can we make sure that our current strategies, or if we're building a 5-year development plan, is going to promote those innovations, or is going to help those positive storylines kind of come to fruition. So that was just trying to sort of bring across the storylines aspect. We just wanted to open it up to Q&A now. If there's any questions on the scenario approach, or potentially how you would do some of these processes in your work, etc. Be lovely to hear. And also again, if anyone wants to put up their hand and say how they've maybe used scenarios in their work, or share some examples, would be really valuable. So just sort of open floor question and answers now, before we wrap up and what we're going to be doing. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. I was looking at the way you were presenting the scenarios. Taking 2 scenarios at the same time.
2 drivers?
2 drivers.
Yes, taking 2 drivers at the same time.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, after analyzing one driver against the other, how do you then reconcile them into something that is very comprehensive for maybe for action, in such a way that you want to maybe, because sometimes when you want to implement some of these things, you realize that you are curtailed by resources. So you want to take those that are much relevant, those that are important, and maybe deal with them first, sort of some prioritization of some sort. So I was just wondering, if we have those many scenarios, how do you go about reconcile them and then you act on them?
Fantastic question. So I don't want to answer in too much depth, because actually that's what our 4th session is going to start with, because I think what you've unpacked is one of the really kind of tricky parts of the scenario. And actually the most important part is actually when you go through the implications and then you put an action plan together. And I think Ketsugili, what you said was so true in terms of we have resource constraints, and as well as resource constraints, we also have strategic constraints. We might already be within a development plan that's law, that's legalized. We can't, so what we're going to do at the beginning of next session is really unpack this very practical way you take these storylines and try and work them into a prioritization and an action plan. So I hope that we can answer your question in detail on Wednesday afternoon. And if there's still questions, we can unpack it a bit more.
Great question. Are there other questions or insights that you want to share from your own experience?
Dennis, you said avenues of thought are being opened up. Can we hear what has sparked something in your mind? What are you thinking of?
Yes, I was looking at the scenarios. Are you getting me?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, when we are looking at those scenarios and trying to combine with the levels of the climate change, yes, you can see that yes, as we go forward, we need to plan ahead so that we are not caught unaware of the coming situations, because it's like most of our planning is ad hoc and focusing on the near future. So we really need to think ahead of time, so that even as we meet these scenarios, we'll be well prepared. So that is the thought that has been created in me.
That's
That is
brilliant.
Fantastic. And Dennis, I hope you feel empowered now as a Foresight thinker and a practitioner, because I think you've really named those two key things that Foresight tries to bring to a planning process, is being prepared for the future and also imagining multiple different futures, so that we move away from this kind of incremental to more transformational, but also less kind of ad hoc, but more structured, to say, if we start to break down what the future could be, can we start to plan very strategically, like 10 years and 15 years ahead, and know some of these drivers, how they might play out.
Yes, yes.
Fantastic.
Thanks so
Thank you.
much.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks for sharing your reflections. Is there anybody else that wants to share anything?
Yes.
Oh, good, Dele.
Yes.
Please.
From what I'm looking at this, it's just my thinking is that foresight is a form of having technologies, so to say, on shelf. On shelf in the sense that the time you need it, you just bring it down. It's a form of, that's my thinking. You see, foresight is actually thinking ahead, but it's also like a strategic research work that has been done and kept on shelf. And in the future, when the need arises, you just put them down and you apply them. That is what I think we can also be thinking about around that line, the issue of on shelf. All what I do right now, to me, it's as if we're developing some technologies to be used in the future, which of course, if the scene is suitable for that particular technology, bring it down and we apply it. That's another way of
I think
looking at
that's a really good point. And the same thing goes for being prepared. For example, had we known COVID was coming, or had at least, built it into our scenarios, we might have had a stockpile of things like masks, right? So you may have, it helps you be ready. And so you're right, looking backwards, you may say, oh my gosh, we actually have done the research on this. It never got scaled out. This might be appropriate now.
That is it. Thank you very much.
Are there other questions? I wanted to make one other comment. One of the things I think is really valuable is this idea of having a lot of different stakeholders in the room when you're running these scenarios. Because if you told me I'm going to have a conversation around unemployment of youth and regional integration, if I'm an agroecologist, I might say, I wonder if I need to be in that conversation, right? But when you break out the scenario, when you start to design the scenarios and you start to build the storylines according to multiple categories, then people will see themselves in those scenarios and see how it might impact what they're working on.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Constance. I'll just share my screen again just to quickly wrap up today. We have a last poll. And I just wanted to kind of go over thank you so much for these reflections. It's so valuable to hear what everybody is kind of taking away and starting. I think Constance and I are probably overjoyed with this bubbling of potential of foresight and really starting to change some of these future planning approaches we have. So we're delighted to hear some of these reflections so far. So today, and I'm sorry, Intle, I know asked at the beginning about the root causes. You wanted to see a bit more about the implications and causes, and we'll try and dig into that very quickly as we open on Wednesday's session. But today we really try to look at digging into the root cause and developing a systems map as one of the very important stages when you ask what seems to be happening. And when you're preparing in your foresight process. And then we dived into kind of what is scenario planning and why it's so valuable in terms of uncertain futures. And we took you through a sort of step-by-step simple process for trying to understand drivers. And remember, we looked at uncertainty and impact of those drivers, And then once you could start to put those drivers together to look at these different storylines. So we hope that everybody's kind of come away with some of these learning outcomes. In terms of Wednesday, we will unfortunately be wrapping up the series, but this is the start, not the end. So we hope we inspire you in that front. But on Wednesday, we're going to be just kind of going towards the end of this long-term planning, towards the end of the Foresight framework, to really kind of bring you towards the process. We're going to be looking about how you apply those scenarios. We had this great question now about how do you actually then make those scenarios practical? How do we prioritize what actions we need to take? We're going to take you through a process of how you then can prioritize the strategies. We then will be introducing another Foresight process and method, which is very, very useful from the policy planning perspective, called backcasting. And again, how you use backcasting to really amend your strategies. And then we will have a very kind of a breakout and some planning together in terms of next steps, in terms of a community of practice, and also starting to map individual and collective needs in terms of future training and more kind of technical backstopping on processes and strategies you have at play. So this is really a chance to sort of map out the next steps for Constance and I to take back to the wider team on what would be the next steps and the demand in terms of further sort of capacity building and training. So we really hope to see you on Wednesday to sort of help us wrap up, to plan for more, essentially. And Pierre, could you run a quick poll? We'd love to hear what you felt of today's session. So if you're able to share your insights into the poll. We have a quick set of questions. So we'd love to know how you rate today's training, if you found it valuable, etc. So from 1 is low and 5 is high. So we'd love to know how you found today's training. And also importantly, did you find this training valuable for your future work? So we'd love to know if you're starting to see how you could put these tools and methods into the work you're going to be doing, and if you're starting to see how you could use Foresight in your work. And then also just a sense if people are starting to feel like they would like some more training and application around Foresight. And this will really help us, again, with the projects and the teams we're working with in terms of next steps. And if we're starting to see some strong demand for more training and application and how we can meet this. So thanks so much for helping us fill the poll. This is really valuable. We got about 70% of the vote. If a couple more of you before you leave the room can vote, that would be great. And thank you for those in the chat box today. It was very active and really valuable to see your insights. So thank you so much for sharing those. It's really valuable. And we're making sure to take some of these questions. And we're really excited to see you on Wednesday, same time, same Zoom link, and a chance for us to all sort of wrap up together. So yeah, I think that's very valuable. And here I think we can wrap up the poll just now. And Pierre, I don't know if you want some
80%, so that's perfect.
Some nice music for us. And if we can have a chance to all just wave again before we meet again on Wednesday.
I'm starting my sound. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Bye-bye. Thank you
Bye,
very much.
Intle. Enjoy
See
the
you
rest of your
Wednesday.
Thanks, everybody.
Enjoy the rest of your holiday.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Great to work
It's
with
really
you.
worth it. I'm happy to be part of you. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
thank you so much. Thanks, Dele. Enjoy the rest of your
Thank you very
holiday.
much.
See you Wednesday.
Yes.
Bye, Roderick.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you, Grace.
Everyone.
Thank you. See you on Wednesday.
Yes, that's great. Yes.
Thank you.
See you Wednesday. Enjoy your holiday.
Thank you.
Yes. Dr. Pepala, thank you for your interventions.
Thank you so much.
Oh, we've got some good music to go out to.
Now music will do.
Thanks, Dr. Rapella. Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Sabrina and Constance, for the great presentation today.
Thank you. Thank
Really,
you so
really.
much.
Thank you, Pierre, for keeping
Thank
us
you.
going and upbeat.
Thank you.